Welcome to this month's Minute with Victor, where Dr. Cotton answers your questions.
This month's question comes from a physician who writes, I'd like to know if I'm required to provide interpreters for patients who don't speak English. I was originally told that I didn't, but then I read where a physician lost a lawsuit because he didn't provide a sign language interpreter for a deaf patient, and now I'm not sure what to do. The difficulty that you're having stems from the fact that you've woven several different laws together, and that's always a recipe for confusion. So let's start by unraveling this. The first thing to determine is whether we're dealing with the Americans with Disabilities Act. If I'm having difficulty communicating because of a disability, perhaps I can't hear or can't speak, then I'm covered by the ADA. And that's a big deal because it requires you to provide me with a reasonable accommodation. In other words, you have to work with me to reduce the impact of my disability. And depending on the circumstances, that might be something simple like speaking slowly or writing things out, but it could also mean that you have to provide a sign language interpreter, which is what happened in this case that you read. The second legal consideration is the LEP guidelines. And LEP stands for Limited English Proficiency, and this covers patients who don't speak English. And the most important aspect of these guidelines is that they don't apply to most private practices. They cover hospitals and a few other places that receive federal financial assistance, but they don't apply to most private practices. So if you're a physician in private practice, the LEP guidelines probably don't apply to you, which means that you have no obligation to provide language interpreters. When we encounter a patient who has a communication barrier, it's important to recognize the difference between a patient who can't speak and a patient who can't speak English. The former is covered by the ADA and entitled to a reasonable accommodation, while the latter is covered by the LEP guidelines and may not be entitled to anything. Thanks again for listening.